So I'd also really like to thank Mary, because, again, without Mary, we wouldn't be here. And also Russell, of course, and Tim, really my mentors here. Russell asked me to talk about critical theory in the university. And I guess the first thing to say about that is that Telos has this sort of very strange relationship to the university. I mean, you can begin with Paul himself. I mean, he started out as an academic. He started Telos as a graduate student. He brought with him as an assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis. But then he was denied tenure. And so he began this sort of, this journey into the wilderness. And strangely enough, I had the same first job at Washington University in St. Louis, and I was also denied tenure by that institution. I spent a couple of years as a management consultant, but he was much more enterprising than I was, and so he went in and he developed Telos into an independent journal, and that was his his incredible contribution, and so. Even though he began with the university, and Telos really depends upon universities for its writers, for its readers, for most of its subscriptions. He's always had, and Telos has always had, this sort of conflicted relationship to universities, and I think we see that. I think most clearly in the way he developed the critique of the new class, right? Because the new class is. Obviously, it began. I guess the first examples would be the Soviet Union and that development of a government bureaucracy that replaces a aristocratic or bourgeois class. But in the United States, you get the same kind of phenomenon with the development of government bureaucracy, university academics as, I guess, a bureaucratic class, and. Telos and Paul were really, at the forefront of criticizing the new class for what it was. But even though Telos, all of the things that Telos took up, Frankfurt School, Carl Schmitt, even all of these things that made their way into the university, thanks to Telos. The one thing that hasn't really made its way into university critical theory is that critique of the new class, right? And the result, though, has been that that critique of the new class, even though it hasn't made it to the university, has made it to the rest of the country, right? Because what we have with Donald Trump is basically the victory of that critique of the new class, and I guess you could say the awakening of the class consciousness of this populist class, right? And so, what I see then as far as the, university critical theory is an inability to sort of be able to engage with that contemporary political phenomenon. Almost structurally so, because, obviously the kind of, I guess, way in which the election of Donald Trump has been such an outrage and a sort of, baffling phenomenon for precisely the university, is precisely the way that the university isn't able to formulate that critique. And so, what I think then for, as far as like critical theory today, I mean, I think that it really plays to Telos' strengths and, the weaknesses of the university. And so that I think for the next, I guess, 50 years of Telos, some of the tasks before us, certainly right now, are, I guess, ways in which we can formulate that, that critique of the new class in a way that can help us to, I suppose, figure out the concerns of populism, right? So, on the one hand, it would have to be a critique of liberalism, right? To try to understand, well, what's the problem with liberalism that has led to its being a kind of ideology of the new class? So, what are the and so what are the limitations of that approach, right? I guess a second piece of it would be to think through on an international level the ways in which liberalism is, has become both a kind of ideology of the West, but also something that isn't the only thing standing anymore, right? I mean, certainly China and Russia are trying to establish an alternative vision of political order or world order. And I think it's necessary for us to kind of try and think through what are the possibilities of these attempts, right? Either as a supporter of liberalism or as a critic. But in any case, we need to understand these alternatives. And then certainly on the on the domestic level, to try and think through that. I guess to imagine a kind of populist critical theory, I suppose, right? So what does it mean to address the concerns that have been brought up by the I guess what you want to call it, the Trump populist revolution? They're obviously the concerns of that critique of the new class, and so if we want to take that seriously, we have to try and draw that out. And then finally, I mean, the final thing is probably something that we've been working on quite a lot, but I think really we're at just the beginning of is trying to think through this issue of political theology, of what it means to sort of imagine theology as totally implicated in politics, but also politics that can't be thought through without some kind of theological perspective. I mean, obviously that's something that we've begun with all the work on Schmidt and work with the radical orthodoxy people, but again, we're really just at the beginning of this. So I mean, I think in all of these areas, I think Telos is really well positioned in a way that, unfortunately, universities are not. So so anyway, that's I'm looking forward to the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Thank you.